My beloved child. Stop scrolling, not because the world has suddenly become silent, but because there are moments when a story arrives exactly when a weary heart is searching for one. Perhaps you did not come looking for these words. Perhaps you only meant to pass by. Yet stories have a strange way of finding the people who need them most. So linger here for a little while. Allow yourself to imagine that heaven has opened the curtains of eternity. Not to predict your future, but to invite you into a deeply personal, fictional journey of hope, mystery, healing, and love. There is a silence you have carried for longer than anyone realizes. Not the silence that fills an empty room. The silence that settles between two souls who once seemed destined to find one another. You have wondered why certain conversations never happened. Why messages remained unwritten. Why feelings that seemed unmistakable somehow dissolved into distance before they could become words. There were evenings when you stared into the fading light and asked questions no one else heard. Was I forgotten? Did they change their mind? Was everything I felt only my imagination? Why does my heart still remember someone who never truly arrived? These questions became companions you never invited. They followed you into ordinary mornings. They sat beside you during celebrations. They whispered through sleepless nights. Sometimes you convinced yourself you had moved on. Then a song played. A familiar scent drifted through the air. A stranger smiled in a certain way. And suddenly the quiet ache returned, reminding you that some stories refuse to disappear simply because time keeps moving. But listen carefully. Not every unanswered question is abandoned. Not every delay is rejection. And not every silence is empty. Imagine, just for this story, that beyond everything your eyes could measure, another conversation had been unfolding all along. A conversation hidden behind ordinary days. A conversation woven through disappointments, missed chances, unexpected detours, and mysterious delays. Suppose there was more happening than anyone could see. Suppose the silence itself had a purpose hidden beneath its weight. Imagine that somewhere, another heart was also asking impossible questions. Why can't I bring myself to reach out? Why does every attempt seem to fall apart? Why do circumstances always interfere? Why does fear become louder exactly when courage begins to rise? Perhaps they wrote messages they never sent. Perhaps they rehearsed conversations during lonely drives beneath endless skies. Perhaps your name rested quietly inside their thoughts while the rest of the world believed they had forgotten. Perhaps they whispered your name only when no one else could hear. Stories often make us believe love moves in straight lines. Reality rarely does. Sometimes roads twist through valleys no traveler expected. Sometimes people carry invisible chains forged long before they ever meet the one they are meant to cherish. Chains made from old disappointments. From childhood wounds. From promises broken by others. From voices that repeated, "You are not enough." Those voices can become prisons. Not prisons built with iron. Prisons built with memory. Imagine someone standing before a door they desperately wish to open. Their hand reaches toward the handle. But every painful experience they've ever survived whispers. If you open this door, you will lose everything again. Fear disguises itself as wisdom. Doubt dresses itself as caution. Old scars pretend to be protection. And suddenly the simplest act. Sending one message. Speaking one honest sentence. Admitting one vulnerable truth. Feels heavier than lifting mountains. This is where many stories quietly disappear. Not because love was absent. But because courage was still learning how to breathe. Yet that is only one layer. Because there are deeper currents flowing beneath this fictional tale. The heart is a mysterious landscape. People often believe obstacles always appear outside them. But sometimes the greatest distance exists within. A person may long for connection while simultaneously fearing it. They may pray for companionship while running from intimacy. They may dream about finding someone who truly understands them, yet hide every authentic part of themselves behind carefully rehearsed smiles. This contradiction confuses everyone involved, including them. Especially them. You have mistaken silence for indifference. They have mistaken fear for safety. And somewhere between those misunderstandings, time continued walking. Have you ever watched fog cover an entire valley? The mountains remain. The rivers remain. The forests remain. Nothing has disappeared. Only visibility has changed. Life often works that way. Circumstances become fog. Misunderstandings become fog. Timing becomes fog. Personal healing becomes fog. Family expectations become fog. Responsibilities become fog. Distance becomes fog. The path still exists, but no traveler can clearly see it. The impatient heart assumes the road ended. The patient heart waits for sunrise. Now imagine another scene. Far from where you are. Someone pauses over an old photograph. Not because they are trapped in the past, but because something inside refuses to stop asking. What if? They remember details they pretend not to remember. The way laughter sounded. The gentleness hidden beneath your strength. The kindness you showed when no one else noticed. The conversation that ended too soon. The goodbye that never felt complete. Memory has strange timing. It often awakens precisely when people believe they have buried it forever. Yet memories alone cannot rewrite unfinished chapters. Something else must awaken first. Hope. Real hope. Not fantasy. Not obsession. The quiet courage that says, perhaps healing is possible. That awakening never happens on anyone else's schedule. It unfolds slowly. Like dawn spreading across mountains while the valley below still believes it is night. Maybe you have become frustrated with waiting. Maybe every delay has felt personal. Maybe disappointment convinced you that unseen doors were permanently locked. Yet imagine for a moment that delays sometimes protect rather than punish. Imagine trying to plant a fragile seed during winter. No amount of desire changes frozen ground. The seed is not rejected. It is preserved. Because premature growth would destroy it. There are seasons when hidden preparation appears identical to abandonment. That illusion has broken countless hearts. But stories worth remembering rarely unfold in straight lines. Heroes wander. Pilgrims doubt. Travelers lose direction. Even hope sometimes whispers instead of shouting. You have looked for dramatic signs. Thunder. Miracles. Instant answers. Instead, life answered with ordinary mornings. Ordinary afternoons. Ordinary evenings. You mistook ordinary for meaningless. Yet some of eternity's greatest transformations begin quietly enough to escape everyone's attention. Consider the tiny crack that appears in thick winter ice. At first it changes nothing. The frozen lake still looks solid. The landscape still appears lifeless. Yet beneath that narrow fracture, movement has begun. Invisible. Persistent. Unstoppable. This fictional story asks you to imagine something similar. What if change had already begun before anyone recognized it? What if invisible healing had started long before visible reunion became possible? What if silence itself had become the workshop where two separate hearts slowly learned lessons they could never have learned together? One heart discovering forgiveness. Another discovering honesty. One learning patience. Another learning vulnerability. One releasing bitterness. Another confronting regret. Growth often happens out of sight. Roots always appear before blossoms. No gardener becomes angry because flowers fail to bloom the day after planting. Yet humans often expect relationships to bloom before either soul has grown strong enough to nurture them. Now picture a long hallway lined with countless doors. Behind each door waits a different version of life. One opens too early. Another opens too late. Another leads toward repeating old pain. Another toward unexpected joy. Most people spend their lives pounding desperately against locked doors. Rarely do they wonder whether another entrance is quietly preparing to open. Patience is difficult because it asks the heart to trust what eyes cannot confirm. That trust feels impossible after disappointment. Especially repeated disappointment. Especially when prayers seem to echo unanswered. Especially when loneliness becomes familiar enough to feel permanent. But permanence is one of fear's favorite illusions. Nothing remains unchanged forever. Storms pass. Night yields. Winter softens. Grief evolves. People transform. Even hearts convinced they can never love again sometimes awaken to unexpected tenderness. The story continues. Because someone else is also changing. Not overnight. Not magically. Slowly. Painfully. Honestly. There were moments they almost reached for you. Moments when your name rested on their lips before silence pulled it back. Moments when they searched for explanations they could not yet articulate. Moments when they believed they had finally found enough courage. Only to encounter another hidden wall inside themselves. They did not understand those walls. How could they explain barriers they themselves could barely recognize? Sometimes people appear distant because they are fighting invisible battles they have never learned to describe. Imagine carrying a room inside your soul that has remained locked since childhood. Every disappointment adds another lock. Every betrayal adds another chain. Eventually you forget what freedom even feels like. Then one unexpected person arrives. Not with force. Not with perfection. But with kindness. Kindness becomes terrifying. Because kindness asks wounded hearts to believe healing might exist. Healing demands trust. Trust requires risk. Risk awakens old fear. And suddenly love feels more frightening than loneliness. This is the paradox hidden beneath so many unfinished stories. Loneliness hurts. Love threatens to expose every wound loneliness successfully concealed. The frightened heart often chooses familiar pain over unfamiliar hope. Not because hope is weaker. Because hope requires surrender. Now imagine heaven, not as a place announcing destinies with certainty, but as the setting of this fictional tale, watching two separate journeys unfold. Not with impatience. Not with disappointment. But with profound compassion. Watching every lesson. Every tear. Every prayer. Every wrong turn. Every unexpected detour. Every ordinary Tuesday that quietly shaped extraordinary futures. The story asks a question many people avoid. What if becoming the right person mattered just as much as finding the right person? That question changes everything. Because it redirects attention away from chasing. Toward becoming. Away from demanding. Toward understanding. Away from fear. Toward growth. Perhaps while you waited for someone else to speak. Your own heart was also being transformed in ways you could not recognize. You became stronger. Kinder. More discerning. Less willing to accept half-hearted affection. More willing to protect your peace. You survived disappointments that once would have shattered you. You learned to stand after seasons that tried to convince you to remain broken. These changes were not accidents. They became part of your story. Every chapter prepared you for another. Even the painful chapters. Especially the painful chapters. Yet there remains one mystery still hidden beneath everything you have heard. A mystery neither heart fully understands. It is not merely fear. It is not merely timing. It is not merely distance. There is another thread quietly woven through this story. Something that neither of you noticed while living your separate lives. Small events that appeared unrelated. Chance meetings. Unexpected cancellations. Conversations interrupted at peculiar moments. Decisions that seemed insignificant when they happened. Coincidences too ordinary to remember. Until one day they begin fitting together like pieces of a forgotten map. Imagine standing before a massive tapestry. From the back, all you see are tangled threads. Knots. Loose ends. Confusion. Nothing appears beautiful. Nothing appears intentional. But if you could somehow step around to the front, every tangled thread would suddenly reveal part of a breathtaking image. Most lives are experienced from the back of the tapestry. Rarely from the front. That is why confusion feels so convincing. But there is one thread in this fictional tale unlike all the others. A single thread that has quietly influenced every delay. Every silence. Every almost message. Every unfinished conversation. It has remained hidden because neither heart was ready to recognize it. Until now. And when that thread is finally revealed, everything you believed about the silence between these two souls will be challenged in a way neither of them could have imagined. But that revelation must wait. My beloved child. The silence had never been as empty as it appeared. If someone had stood where you stood, they would have seen only distance. They would have counted unanswered messages, forgotten opportunities, birthdays that passed without a word, seasons that changed while nothing seemed to move. They would have called it coincidence. They would have called it bad timing. They would have whispered that the story had already ended. But stories that matter often disappear beneath the surface before they rise again. Imagine an old lighthouse standing against a restless sea. From the shore it looks motionless. Unchanging. Forgotten. Yet inside, unseen hands continue tending the flame every single night. That is how unseen hope works in this story. It survives long after everyone believes it has gone out. Far away, another life continued moving through ordinary routines. Morning alarms. Crowded streets. Half-finished conversations. Smiles offered to strangers while carrying invisible exhaustion. To everyone around them, they appeared to be moving forward. But quiet moments betrayed a different truth. Sometimes they would pause in the grocery store because a familiar fragrance unexpectedly carried them into a memory they thought had disappeared. Sometimes they laughed with friends while wondering why one face kept appearing in the corner of every joyful moment. Sometimes they reached for their phone without understanding why. Your name would almost appear on the screen. Almost. Then hesitation returned like an old shadow. Not because affection had vanished. Because fear still spoke louder than hope. Fear has an unusual way of convincing people that tomorrow will always offer another chance. Tomorrow becomes next week. Next week becomes another season. Eventually silence begins pretending to be permanent. Yet permanence was never the truth. Inside this fictional tale, every passing month quietly reshaped two hearts in ways neither could recognize. One learned how to forgive without receiving an apology. The other learned how regret becomes heavier than rejection. One discovered peace inside solitude. The other discovered that success means very little if no one truly knows who you are. Growth arrived wearing ordinary clothes. No fanfare. No thunder. Only small choices repeated again and again. One evening they found themselves standing beside a window while rain traced slow paths across the glass. The city lights shimmered in blurred reflections. For reasons they could not explain, they whispered a single sentence into the empty room. I wonder if they're happy. The word surprised even them. Months had passed since they had allowed themselves to think that honestly. Questions they had buried returned one after another. Did I misunderstand everything? Did I let fear decide for me? Did I walk away from something that deserved courage instead? No answer came. Only silence. But this silence felt different. Not cold. Not empty. It felt like the moment before dawn when darkness knows its time is almost over. Meanwhile, your own journey had been changing too. You stopped searching every face for familiar eyes. You stopped measuring your worth by someone else's absence. You slowly built a life that did not depend upon being chosen. Ironically, that quiet transformation changed everything. Because love that grows from desperation rarely survives. Love that grows from wholeness has room to breathe. This is one of the quiet mysteries hidden inside our story. Sometimes the greatest preparation for reunion is learning how to stand peacefully on your own. That lesson never feels exciting while it is happening. It feels lonely. It feels unfair. It feels invisible. Yet invisible foundations hold the greatest buildings. There was another reason the silence endured. Not because destiny delighted in delay. Not because anyone wished suffering upon either soul. But because unfinished healing has a way of repeating itself inside every new relationship. Old wounds borrow new names. Old fears wear different faces. Until they are recognized, they quietly rewrite every chapter. Neither of you understood this before. Now, slowly, the truth was beginning to emerge. One night they opened a forgotten box tucked away inside a closet. Letters. Photographs. Small reminders of lives once lived. Among those forgotten memories was something astonishingly ordinary. A note. Nothing dramatic. Nothing prophetic. Just a few simple words written years earlier. Yet reading them again stirred something that had remained asleep. They realized how often they had mistaken vulnerability for weakness. How many opportunities they had abandoned because certainty felt impossible. How many conversations they had postponed until they disappeared altogether. Regret is a patient teacher. It rarely shouts. It waits until the heart is finally willing to listen. From that evening forward, subtle changes began unfolding. They became more honest. Not with everyone. With themselves. That is always where transformation begins. At first no one noticed. Not family. Not friends. Not coworkers. External lives continued looking exactly the same. Yet internally, old walls had begun to crack. And once truth enters through even the smallest opening, fear slowly loses its authority. Still. One final barrier remained. Not outside them. Inside. A belief planted long ago that whispered, if you reach out now, it is already too late. That lie has ended countless beautiful stories before they ever began. Because time can make people believe that missed opportunities can never be redeemed. Yet our story has not reached its ending. In fact, it is approaching the moment where everything begins to shift. For somewhere beyond what either heart could yet see, a single unexpected event was already moving quietly toward both of your lives. Neither of you had planned it. Neither of you could predict it. It seemed completely unrelated. Just another ordinary day waiting to happen. But sometimes the smallest interruption changes the direction of an entire story. And when that unexpected moment finally arrives, one decision, made in only a few seconds, will force both hearts to confront the truth they have avoided for far too long. That moment is closer than either of them realizes, and it will change everything. My beloved child. Every story reaches a moment when silence can no longer hide the truth. Not because every question suddenly receives an answer. Not because every wound instantly disappears. But because the heart grows tired of carrying what it was never meant to carry alone. The morning arrived like any other. The sun climbed quietly above the horizon. People hurried through familiar routines. Coffee cooled in forgotten mugs. Traffic lights changed from red to green. Children laughed somewhere in the distance. Nothing appeared extraordinary. Yet extraordinary moments rarely announce themselves. They slip into ordinary days disguised as coincidence. Far away, they paused in the middle of an ordinary task. A memory surfaced with unexpected clarity. Not just your face. Not merely your name. But the feeling they had experienced whenever they imagined a future that felt honest. For the first time in a long while, they did not push the memory away. They remained with it. They allowed themselves to feel both the warmth and the ache. It was uncomfortable. It was humbling. It was also freeing. Because avoiding the truth had become far more exhausting than facing it. Meanwhile, your own journey had quietly reached a different kind of peace. You were no longer waiting every hour for something to happen. You had begun rediscovering forgotten dreams. Small joys returned. A sunrise seemed brighter. A conversation with a friend lasted a little longer. You laughed without feeling guilty for moving forward. The story reminds us that healing is not the same as forgetting. Healing means the memory no longer controls every tomorrow. Imagine two rivers flowing through separate valleys. For years they travel alone, shaped by different landscapes. One passes through rocky cliffs. The other winds through quiet forests. Neither knows where the other has been. Yet both continue moving toward the sea. The journey changes each river. By the time they finally meet, they are no longer the same waters that began the journey. That is how people change. Not by standing still. By continuing to flow. There comes a point when fear realizes it is losing its grip. It makes one final attempt. It whispers old lies. What if you are rejected? What if too much time has passed? What if nothing is the way you remember? Those whispers are familiar because they have echoed through countless hearts. But something had changed. This time, another voice answered. Not louder. Simply steadier. What if honesty is worth the risk? That single thought became the beginning of courage. Not dramatic courage. Quiet courage. The kind that trembles but keeps moving anyway. In our fictional tale, this is where the hidden reason behind the silence finally begins to make sense. It was never a single obstacle. It was many small ones woven together. Old fears. Poor timing. Unspoken expectations. Misunderstood intentions. Lives moving in different directions before either person had learned how to communicate with complete honesty. Each thread looked insignificant on its own. Together, they formed a wall that seemed impossible to cross. Yet walls built one stone at a time can also be dismantled one stone at a time. No miracle erased the past. No mysterious force rewrote every mistake. Instead, people changed. That became the true turning point. Because transformed hearts make different choices than frightened hearts. As evening settled, the sky filled with soft shades of gold and violet. A breeze carried the scent of rain across the quiet streets. For reasons impossible to explain, they picked up their phone. Not with certainty. Not with confidence. Only with sincerity. They stared at the empty screen. Their hands hesitated. Old doubts returned for one final moment. Then they remembered every conversation they had imagined but never lived. Every truth they had buried. Every opportunity postponed. They realized something simple. Silence could no longer protect them from regret. Only honesty could. Across the distance, you knew nothing of this moment. You were living your own ordinary evening. Perhaps reading. Perhaps walking beneath the fading light. Perhaps simply enjoying a rare moment of peace. Life often prepares its greatest surprises while we are busy believing nothing unusual is happening. The story does not reveal whether the message was sent. It does not promise that every ending becomes the one we hope for. Because the deepest lesson was never about guaranteeing a particular outcome. It was about becoming the kind of person who chooses truth over fear. Who chooses compassion over bitterness. Who chooses hope without demanding certainty. Whether two paths ultimately become one is only part of the story. The greater miracle is discovering that love, when rooted in honesty, begins by transforming the heart before it transforms any relationship. And perhaps that is the most surprising reason of all. The silence was never simply keeping two people apart. It was inviting both of them to become stronger, wiser, and more authentic before the next chapter could begin. As the first stars appeared above the horizon, one final decision remained unwritten. A message hovered between being imagined and being sent. A future balanced delicately between fear and courage. And somewhere beyond the last light of day, a brand new chapter waited. Not as a promise of certainty, but as an invitation to choose hope, honesty, and healing over the silence that had lasted for far too long.